Hello and welcome back, my darling viewers. For those of you who are new here, my name is Miranda and I am the Enchantress of Avalon. So for today's video, I've decided to do a follow-up to my most viewed video of all time on this channel, which was my A Fairy's Child, La Belle Dame Sans Merci interpreted video that I did back last August. So it's an older video, but it has gotten a lot of views and I thought, well, why not follow up on that video? But before I get into the content of this video, I do want to make a quick announcement, and that is that I am changing my upload schedule. Instead of doing a twice weekly upload on both Mondays and Fridays, it is going to be once weekly upload on Mondays, and I hope everyone enjoys this new schedule. It will allow me a lot more time to devote to a single video as opposed to splitting my attention to two videos. So I'm hoping to produce better content this way for all of my lovely subscribers and viewers. So, to begin this video off, I want to do something I did not do in my last video about this poem, and that is to actually read the poem. So, this is my lovely little collection of the Romantic Poets. It's one of those Flexibound editions, and it is Byron Coleridge, Blake, Wordsworth, Shelley, and Keats, and this is a John Keats poem. So, La Belle Dame Sans Merci is the title, obviously. Oh, what can ail thee, knight-at-arms, alone and palely loitering? The sedge has withered from the lake, and no birds sing. Oh, what can ail thee, knight-at-arms, so haggard and so woe-begone? The squirrel's granary is full, and the harvest's done. I see a lily on thy brow, with anguish moist in fever dew, and on thy cheeks a fading rose fast withereth too. I met a lady in the meads, full beautiful, a fairy's child. Her hair was long, her foot was light, and her eyes were wild. I made a garland for her head, and bracelets too, in fragrant zone. She looked at me as she did love, and made sweet moan. I set her on my pacing steed, and nothing else saw all day long, for sidelong would she bend and sing a fairy song. She found me roots of relish sweet, and honey wild, and manna dew, and sure in language strange she said, I love thee true. She took me to her elfin grot, and there she wept and sighed full sore, and there I shut her wild, wild eyes with kisses for. And there she lulled me asleep, and there I dreamed, ah, woe betide, the latest dream I ever dreamed, on that cold hillside. I saw pale kings and princes too, pale warriors, death pale were they all. They cried, La Belle Dame Sans Merci has thee in her enthrall. I saw their starved lips in the gloam, with horrid warning gaped wide, and I awoke and found me here on the cold hillside. And this is why I sojourn here, alone and palely loitering, though the sedge is withered from the lake, and no birds sing. Okay, so through that beautiful, flowery, fanciful language, which I absolutely adore. I am a poet myself, and I adore the Romantic poets above all other poets. And Keats is definitely one of my very, very favorites. I go between Keats and Shelley being my absolute favorite of the Romantics, but Keats's La Belle Dame Sans Merci is probably my favorite romantic poem of all time. So that's why we talk about it so much on this channel, and it's also why I write about it on my blog, and why it fits me. And basically, beyond all that language, is the story of a knight who is enthralled by this beautiful fairy woman and taken into her elfin grot into fairyland. And there he becomes her lover, right? That is what all of that fanciful language is. He couldn't outright talk about the sex, but he implied it, talking about kisses and talking about having sweet moans. That was the Romantic poet equivalent of literally talking about sex, because they couldn't just outright state the sexual acts. So we have this knight who goes into fairyland with this fairy woman and has an affair with her. And then at night he's dreaming, and these death pale princes and knights and kings tell him that La Belle Dame Saint Merci has you in thrall. So he is enthralled by this beautiful fairy woman, right? Now, in my last video, and as well as I also did this in my first ever blog post analyzing this poem, I discussed how Morgan Le Fay and La Belle Dame Saint Merci are connected. Because ever since I first read this poem, I always felt that the fairy could very well be Morgan Le Fay herself. Morgan has in her mythos this connection to knights, and she is often said to have affairs with knights, to enthrall knights, to use magic on knights, and even has an entire valley called the Val Saint-Retour, where she traps unloyal knights, knights who are not loyal in love specifically. She traps in the Val Saint-Retour. So how else could I connect any other fairy queen, fairy goddess, or just fairy woman with this when it just so perfectly fits Morgan's portrayal in the Arthuriad? I think that it definitely is a Morgan-centric narrative. Now, I want to go over the species of fairy, separate from the Morgan Le Fay issue, because Morgan, I believe, is many types of fairies. I think in her different aspects, she's different types of fae. When she is in her Lady of Avalon, Lady of the Lake aspect, she is more of a Garuth Anun, a lake maiden. But when she is in her knight enthralling, sexual, voracious aspect, she's a Leanan Sidhe. And that is the type of fairy woman we are dealing with in this John Keats poem. A Leanan Sidhe is a breed of fairy, a species of fairy, who has sexual relations with artistic sorts, including, painters, poets, other sort of writers. And through this act of having these sexual liaisons with them, these trysts, she inspires him to greater heights of achievement. That's just amazing, right? And I often also connect the Leanan Sidhe with the concept of the rock and roll groupies of the 60s and 70s, that having that sexual relationship to inspire arts. It goes from poets to musicians, but it's entwined, right? It's very connected. And I used all of these concepts in my most recent short story published on my blog, RoseOfAvalon.life, entitled John Keats and the Leanan Sidhe. And it is the story of John Keats falling in love with a Leanan Sidhe. And since he famously, in the real world, died very young of tuberculosis, instead of having him withering and dying of tuberculosis, which is a withering disease, I had him go faking his death in the mortal world to go into fairy and marry and father a race of fairy offspring with a Leanan Sidhe. And then I also connected it in with the rock and roll muses, in that one of their daughters was a rock and roll muse. And she brought back the next, fairy king figure. I won't spoil who I made that in that story, but I will link the story down in the description box below if anyone's interested in how I reinterpreted some history connected to this poem. And I'll also link down in the description box some of my other analyses of this poem on my blog. So, the Leanan Sidhe is known to, after she either tires of her lover or starts just missing her home in fairy, leaving him to go ahead and return to fairy. And when she leaves, because of this kind of parasitic bond they have, he begins to wither from longing of her and dying a slow and painful death. And again, John Keats' actual death from tuberculosis is mirrored here. I think that's why he wrote La Belle Dame sans Merci, because this is a poem about someone withering and dying a slow and painful death that he himself was already going through. Because tuberculosis is not something that you just like that. It does take a lot of time. This is why back then it was called consumption, because it was a slow burning disease that would slowly consume you little by little. It's a really horrific way to die, and it's really sad. Now, he did a beautiful job of integrating older fairy lore into his poetic world, and also it being inspired by Arthurian romances and just romances of the Middle Ages in general, because he did choose a knight as his male protagonist in the story. And his female lead is a fairy woman, right? He doesn't imply she's anything else. She's a magical fairy woman. And we have this happening time and time again in Celtic lore, and it carried straight on through the Arthurian lore, because I've said this once, I've said this 1,000 times. The Arthurian legends are directly inspired by Celtic folklore and myth. They are essentially the continuation and reinterpretation of Celtic myth for the medieval period. And we've just latched onto that ever since. So anyone who's really interested in the medieval Arthurian legends should really read Celtic folklore and myth, because it's all there. That is where you find the basis. That's where you can entwine and have connections between an Arthurian figure and a goddess or a god. And most Arthurian figures were deities to begin with. It's a whole thing. I've done so many videos on it. I'll do many more on this topic. But I think that Keats did such a beautiful job of entwining those concepts together in this poem. And obviously the taking into fairy and then abandoning a lover, it's part of the Leanan Sidhe mythos. It's also being taken into fairy is very common in all fairy lore, in Celtic culture especially. And then the final thing I wanted to relate about this was the absolute beauty of the title. Belle Dame means beautiful woman, right? So she's the beautiful woman without mercy, or the beautiful woman without gratitude. It could also be read as that. But it does also relate to the toxic plant, at least toxic in high doses, belladonna, which literally means pretty lady, right? So I feel like he probably knew of belladonna, and he thought, belladonna is Italian for pretty lady. Why don't I have my figure being called a belle dame, a beautiful woman? And have her nature be sort of toxic, just like this plant is. And it's incredible. I think it's brilliant. I don't know if he really knew it, but I think it's likely that he could have, and it's certainly a fun connection, right? And I just wanted to, very last little note, is I have a little connection to Practical Magic, one of my all-time favorite movies, in that, and books as well. The book is incredible. Belladonna is actually what kills Jimmy in Practical Magic. Because in low doses, it is a sleep aid, and that's how Jillian had been using it. But then they accidentally overdose him, and they kill him. Yeah, so it's belladonna poisoning. Just wanted to note that. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. And if you have, please like, comment, subscribe, and check out my blog at roseofavalon.life. Have a great day, and I'll see you next week. Bye now.